I don't want her. I never did. Those words, spat through a cloud of heavy cigar smoke by the most feared man in Dakota, should have been Leela's absolute death sentence. Sebastian Castellano didn't take prisoners, and he certainly didn't take collateral from rival bloodlines. But life in the underworld doesn't care about what a boss desires. It only cares about leverage. What Sebastian didn't know, as he looked at the trembling, ruined woman standing on his mahogany floor, was that this unwanted pawn was about to become the only thing standing between his empire and absolute ashes. Welcome to a story of blood, betrayal, and an unexpected salvation. The rain in Dakota always felt like a judgment. It lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sebastian Castellano's penthouse high above the Gold Coast, distorting the city lights into angry, bleeding streaks of neon. Sebastian stood with his back to the room, a crystal tumbler of Macallan 25 resting loosely in his right hand. He was 34, but the brutal, grinding reality of leading the Castellano syndicate, the modern remnant of the original Dakota outfit, made his eyes look ancient. Behind him, the heavy oak doors of his office opened, admitting the scent of damp wool, cheap cologne, and profound fear. "Boss," came the gravelly voice of Arthur, his underboss and oldest friend. "Rossi is here." Sebastian didn't turn. "Does he have my money?" "No." "But he brought a proposition." Sebastian finally turned, the sharp, tailored lines of his charcoal suit doing nothing to soften the lethal grace of his movements. Standing in the center of the Persian rug was Silvio Rossi, a mid-level capo who ran the docks near Lake Michigan. Silvio was sweating profusely, his hands trembling as he clutched a saturated fedora. But Sebastian's cold, obsidian gaze didn't linger on the pathetic man. It immediately caught on the figure standing slightly behind him. A woman. She was soaked to the bone, her dark trench coat plastered to a slender frame. Her dark hair hung in wet ribbons around a pale face that bore the unmistakable, sharp-cheeked lineage of the Rossi family. But unlike her father, who looked ready to collapse into a puddle of his own terror, her eyes, a striking, stormy hazel, were locked onto Sebastian with a startling, defiant clarity. "Sebastian, please!" Silvio sputtered, his voice cracking. "The shipments got intercepted by the feds out at O'Hare. 3 million in product? Gone. I need a month. Just 1 month." "You owed me the 3 million 2 weeks ago, Silvio," Sebastian said softly. His quiet voice was legendary. The softer Sebastian spoke, the closer someone was to a shallow grave in the Pine Barrens. "Now the interest has bumped it to 4. You don't have $4 million. You don't have $400. I have something better, something of equal value." Silvio stepped aside, roughly grabbing the woman's arm and yanking her forward. She stumbled, but caught her balance, her jaw tightening. "My daughter, Lila." Silence dropped over the vast office, heavy and suffocating. Arthur shifted uncomfortably by the door. "Your daughter," Sebastian repeated, tasting the absolute absurdity of the words. He walked slowly toward them, the soft padding of his Italian leather shoes the only sound in the room. He stopped 2 feet from Lila. She didn't flinch. Up close, he could see a faint bruise forming along her jawline, a fresh mark. Her father's doing, undoubtedly. "She's smart, educated. A doctor," Silvio babbled, desperation turning his words into a frantic slurry. "She can be of use to you. Keep her as collateral, a guarantee that I will get your money. If I don't, you keep her, sell her, do whatever you want. She's yours." Lila closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. When she opened them, the storm in her hazel irises had frozen into ice. She had been sold like a prized mare, stripped of her humanity by the man who was supposed to protect her. Sebastian stared at her, analyzing her posture, the steady rise and fall of her chest. She was terrified, but she was controlling it. That fascinated him for exactly 3 seconds, before disgust washed it away. "Take her away," Sebastian said coldly, turning his back on them and walking toward his desk. "Sebastian, wait!" "I don't want her. I never did," Sebastian snapped, his voice finally rising, cracking like a whip through the room. He slammed his glass down on the desk. "What do you think this is, Silvio? The Middle Ages? We don't trade in princesses for debts. I run a billion-dollar logistics and protection empire, not a human trafficking ring. Arthur, take Silvio down to the basement. Call the cleanup crew." Silvio screamed, falling to his knees, but Arthur and 2 massive enforcers were already dragging him toward the door. "Wait." A quiet, remarkably steady voice cut through the chaos. Sebastian paused, He looked at Leela. If you kill him, Leela said, her voice raspy but clear, the commission will demand a sit-down. The Rossi name still holds a seat at the table in New York. You kill a made man over a $3 million debt without a sanctioned vote, you start a war with the East Coast. Sebastian's eyes narrowed. She wasn't just a pretty pawn. She knew the politics. She knew the rules of the Cosa Nostra. And what do you suggest, Leela Rossi? Sebastian asked, his tone mocking. Keep me, she said, lifting her chin. The commission recognizes blood collateral. If you hold me, it buys him 30 days legally. It buys you time to seize his assets through the legitimate channels without firing a shot. It keeps the FBI off your back and the New York families in their lane. Arthur, pausing with his grip on Silvio's collar, looked at Sebastian. She's not wrong, boss. The Moretti family in Brooklyn has been looking for an excuse to move into our territory. Unsanctioned blood on the floor gives them the green light. Sebastian stared at Lila. She was offering herself up to a monster to save a father who had just sold her. It made no sense. It defied the ruthless logic he lived by. Fine, Sebastian practically spat. 30 days. Put Silvio on the street and get her out of my sight. Lock her in the East Wing guest quarters. As Arthur dragged her father away, Leela stood alone in the center of the room. Sebastian refused to look at her, staring instead out at the bleeding city. He had taken the collateral. He had accepted the burden. But he promised himself one thing. He would never, ever let her become anything more than a number on a ledger. The east wing of the Castellano penthouse was larger than most suburban homes. For Lila, it was a beautifully decorated tomb. 3 days had passed since she had been traded. 3 days of deafening silence, catered meals delivered by stone-faced guards, and an overwhelming sense of dread. She was a ghost, haunting an empire built on blood. Lila stood by the window, watching the traffic crawl along Lakeshore Drive. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was Dr. Lila Rossi, former chief resident of trauma surgery at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. She had spent her life running away from the shadow of her family's criminal ties. She had saved lives, built a respectable existence, and ignored the whispered rumors about her father's dockside activities. But the mob always collected its due. When her father's illegal gambling debts caught up with him, he had used her name, forged her signature, and set up a phantom clinic to launder his stolen money. The medical board stripped her of her license, the hospital fired her, and the FBI was hovering. She had lost everything to protect her younger sister, Sophia, who was still in college and blissfully unaware of the danger. Lila had traded her freedom to Sebastian to ensure her father stayed alive long enough to keep the wolves away from Sophia. A sharp knock broke her reverie. The heavy door unlocked and a young maid scuttled in, leaving a tray of food before practically sprinting away. Lila sighed. She had not seen Sebastian Castellano since that first night, the ghost boss. That evening, the silence of the penthouse was shattered. It started with a muted thud from the hallway, followed by a string of vicious, panicked curses. Lila moved to her door, pressing her ear against the heavy wood. Put him on the table! God damn it, keep pressure on the wound! It was Arthur's voice, tight with panic. Where's the doc? Another voice yelled. Dead. They hit his clinic too. It's a coordinated strike. Lila's heart hammered against her ribs. Medical emergencies were her domain. The instinct to heal, drilled into her through years of grueling residencies, flared violently to life. She backed away from the door, grabbed a heavy bronze bookend from the desk, and waited. When the guard stationed outside her door momentarily stepped away to look down the hall, Lila slipped out. She followed the trail of blood droplets on the imported marble floor, leading her to the vast stainless steel kitchen. The sight that greeted her was pure chaos. A man, one of Sebastian's enforcers, a young kid named Leo, was splayed across the massive center island. His shirt was soaked in crimson, and a terrifying amount of arterial blood was pooling on the pristine countertops. Arthur was frantically pressing a towel against the kid's shoulder, his hands slipping in the gore. Sebastian stood at the head of the table, his white shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing heavily tattooed forearms. He was on a burner phone, his face a mask of cold fury. Get a civilian doctor, I don't care how much it costs. Put a gun to their head if you have to. He'll be dead before anyone gets here, Lila said. Every head snapped toward her. 3 guns were instantly drawn and pointed at her chest. Lila didn't blink. She looked directly at Sebastian. That's an arterial bleed. The subclavian artery is compromised. He has maybe 4 minutes before he goes into hypovolemic shock, and 6 minutes before irreversible brain death from blood loss. Sebastian slowly lowered his phone. He signaled his men to drop their weapons. You're a doctor, he stated, remembering Silvio's frantic pitch. I'm a trauma surgeon, Lila corrected, stepping forward. The fear was gone, replaced by the icy calm of the operating room. Get me a first aid kit, a real one. Alcohol, forceps, hemostats, thick gauge thread, and a bright light. Now, her voice held a command that rivaled Sebastian's. For a second, the men hesitated, looking to their boss. Do what she says, Sebastian roared. Within 30 seconds, an expansive black tactical medical kit was thrown onto the counter. Lila ripped it open. She scrubbed her hands with raw iodine, ignoring the sting, and moved Arthur out of the way. Hold him down, she ordered Sebastian. Sebastian stepped up, placing his large, calloused hands heavily on Leo's shoulders. As Lila worked, digging into the wound with sanitized forceps to clamp the severed artery, Sebastian watched her. He had expected her to faint. He had expected her to cry. Instead, he saw a machine of pure, beautiful efficiency. Her hands, covered in his man's blood, were completely steady. Her face was set in lines of absolute concentration. She wasn't a mafia princess. She was a soldier in a different kind of war. Got it, Lila breathed out, the metallic click of the hemostat echoing loudly in the silent kitchen. The horrific spurting of blood immediately ceased. She spent the next 45 minutes meticulously cleaning, stitching, and bandaging the wound. She issued orders for IV fluids and antibiotics, which Arthur scrambled to fulfill from the estate's private stash. When it was over, Leo was pale, but breathing steadily. Lila stepped back, leaning against the counter. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving her exhausted and acutely aware of her blood-soaked hands. Sebastian handed her a clean, wet towel. Their fingers brushed, his skin was burning hot, hers was freezing cold. You saved my man, Sebastian said softly, the harshness gone from his voice, replaced by a dangerous, evaluating curiosity. I'm a doctor. It's what I do, Lila replied, wiping the blood from her skin. She looked up at him, refusing to be intimidated by the raw power radiating from him. Your syndicate is under attack. The Morettis made a move. They thought I was weak, Sebastian said, his jaw tightening. They thought wrong. They took out your doctor, Lila pointed out. They knew your infrastructure. You have a leak. Sebastian stepped closer. The proximity was overwhelming. He smelled of rain, gunpowder, and expensive scotch. Why are you telling me this, Lila? You should be praying they kill me. It would free you. Lila met his gaze. Because if you die, your men will kill me out of spite, or the Morettis will kill me for sport. My survival is currently tied to yours, Mr. Castellano. I don't want you. I never did. But right now, I need you alive. Sebastian's lips twitched into a shadow of a smirk. She had thrown his own words right back at him. For the first time in his brutal, calculated life, Sebastian Castellano realized he was looking at an equal. Then I suggest you stay close, doctor, he murmured, because the war just started. The attack in the kitchen changed the atmosphere in the penthouse. Lila was no longer treated as a prisoner. She was an asset. She was given unrestricted access to the estate, heavily guarded, of course, but she could breathe. 2 weeks into her 30-day sentence, the Castellano family hosted the annual gala of the patron saints at the Drake Hotel. It was a massive, ostentatious charity event that served as a neutral ground for the Midwest and East Coast families to posture, negotiate, and flaunt their wealth. Sebastian informed Lila she was attending. I am not a piece of arm candy for you to parade around to show you conquered the Rossi family, Lila hissed as a team of stylists flooded her room with silk and diamonds. Sebastian, leaning against the doorframe in a perfectly cut black tuxedo, looked at her with a cold, unyielding stare. You will wear the dress, Lila. The Moretti family will be there. They need to see that my house is in order, that my assets are secured, and that the Rossi debt is being managed. You are a symbol of my control. Play your part, and your father gets his 30 days. Defy me, and I feed him to the fishes tonight. Lila wore the dress. It was a breathtaking, backless emerald green gown that clung to her curves like liquid glass. When she stepped out of her room, Sebastian's breath hitched a microscopic reaction, invisible to anyone but her. He quickly masked it with a scowl, offering his arm. The ballroom at the Drake was a sea of false smiles, hidden weapons, and deadly intent. Lila walked beside Sebastian, acting the part of the demure, conquered daughter. She felt the predatory stares of the other mob bosses, the whispering of the wives. Throughout the night, Lila stayed glued to Sebastian's side. She noticed the subtle dynamics. Arthur hovering near the exits, the silent communication between Sebastian's guards, the tense, venomous politeness when Sebastian shook hands with Victor Moretti, the ruthless underboss of the Brooklyn Syndicate. An hour into the dinner, the waiter approached their table, pouring fresh champagne. Sebastian picked up his flute, raising it for a toast proposed by the mayor of Dakota, who was firmly in Sebastian's pocket. Lila, trained to notice the smallest anomalies in human physiology, caught a flicker of movement. The waiter's hand had trembled, just a fraction, and as Sebastian raised the glass to his lips, Lila saw a faint, milky residue clinging to the crystal rim. Digitalis. The thought hit her with the force of a freight train. Concentrated foxglove extract. Odorless, slightly bitter, causes rapid cardiac arrest. The symptoms mimic a massive natural heart attack. Sebastian's lips touched the glass. No! Lila lunged forward. She smacked the heavy crystal flute out of Sebastian's hand. It shattered against the marble table, showering champagne and glass over the surrounding guests. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Guards surged forward. Sebastian grabbed Lila by the waist, violently pulling her behind him, his other hand diving into his tuxedo jacket for his sidearm. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Sebastian roared, staring at her as the room fell into a shocked, dangerous silence. "The glass," Lila gasped, pointing at the shattered remains. "It was poisoned. I saw the residue. Where's the waiter?" Arthur barked an order, and two men sprinted toward the kitchen. They returned a moment later, faces pale. Waiter's dead in the pantry, throat slit. The guy pouring the drinks was an imposter. Sebastian's blood ran cold. He looked at Lila, his chest heaving. She had just saved his life. Again. But in front of the entire commission, in front of the Morettis, she had shattered the illusion of his absolute control. "Get the cars." "Now," Sebastian ordered Arthur. They moved like a militarized unit. Sebastian kept a tight grip on Lila's hand, dragging her through the service corridors to the underground parking garage. The air was thick with tension. They piled into the armored SUV, Arthur taking the wheel, tires squealing as they broke through the security barrier, and tore out onto the wet Dakota street. In the back seat, the silence was suffocating. Sebastian stared out the tinted window, his jaw clenched so tight Lila thought it might break. "Who knew about the seating arrangements?" Lila asked quietly, the adrenaline slowly leaving her system. Sebastian didn't answer. "Sebastian," she pressed, "someone had to know exactly which glass was yours." The waiter was planted. "This wasn't a random hit. This was surgical." Sebastian slowly turned his head to look at her. The streetlights flickered over his face, revealing a vulnerability, a profound exhaustion that he had never let anyone see. "Only 3 people knew the exact floor plan and catering schedule," Sebastian said, his voice a dead, hollow rasp. "Me, Arthur." He paused, closing his eyes. "And Lorenzo?" Lila frowned. "Who is Lorenzo?" "My younger brother," Sebastian whispered, the words sounding like ash in his mouth. "He runs the Southside operations." Lila felt a chill trace down her spine. The leak, the dead mob doctor, the coordinated strike, the poisoned glass. It wasn't just a rival family moving in. It was a coup from inside the house. Sebastian looked down at Lila's hand, which was still gripping his sleeve. He realized, with a sickening jolt of clarity, that in a world where his own flesh and blood was trying to murder him, the only person he could genuinely trust was the woman he had bought to settle a debt. "Arthur," Sebastian commanded, his voice hardening back into the icy tone of the boss. "Don't take us back to the penthouse. It's compromised. Take us to the safe house in the West Loop, the underground bunker." "Yes, boss," Arthur replied, accelerating the heavy vehicle. Sebastian turned fully toward Lila. The space between them in the back seat suddenly felt incredibly small, incredibly charged. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer a pawn. She was his lifeline. "You just started a civil war, Doctor," Sebastian murmured, reaching out and gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his thumb lingering against the soft skin of her jaw. Lila held his gaze, her heart hammering not from fear of the Mafia, but from the sudden, terrifying heat in his dark eyes. "I didn't start it," Lila replied softly, "but I intend to help you finish it." The West Loop safe house wasn't merely a secure location. It was a ghost facility. Buried 3 stories beneath a dilapidated, heavily secured meatpacking warehouse, the bunker had originally been built during the Cold War by a paranoid steel magnate. Sebastian's father had purchased it in the late 90s, retrofitting it with enough reinforced concrete, off-grid generators, and military-grade servers to withstand a small apocalypse, or, in this case, a Castellano family civil war. The heavy steel vault door hissed shut behind them, sealing them in a subterranean world of harsh fluorescent lighting and oppressive silence. Arthur immediately moved to the communication console, initiating a lockdown protocol that severed the bunker's digital footprint from the outside world. "Wipe the logs," Sebastian ordered, stripping off his tuxedo jacket and throwing it onto a stainless steel table. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving behind a cold, terrifying clarity. "Switch to the localized, air-gapped network. And get me Kroll Associates on the encrypted satellite line. I want a forensic audit of every shell company Lorenzo has touched in the last 5 years. If he's funding a coup, he's moving capital." Lila stood near the entrance, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The emerald green gown, which had looked so radiant at the Drake Hotel, now felt like a target painted on her back. She watched Sebastian pace the concrete floor. He was a caged tiger, furious and bleeding from a dozen invisible wounds. "You're bleeding," Lila said softly, stepping forward. Sebastian paused, looking down at his right hand. A jagged piece of crystal from the poisoned champagne flute had sliced deeply into his palm when she had knocked it away. He hadn't even noticed. "Sit down," she instructed, her voice finding that steady, clinical rhythm that grounded her. She pointed to a folding chair near the medical supply cabinet. For a moment, it looked like he would refuse. He was the boss. He didn't take orders, especially not in a moment of extreme vulnerability. But his dark eyes met hers, and something in his rigid posture broke. He sat. Lila gathered supplies: saline, gauze, a suture kit. She pulled up a stool directly in front of him. The proximity was startling. Down here, stripped of the penthouse's luxury and the city's noise, there was nowhere to hide. She took his large, calloused hand in hers. His skin was warm, his pulse thready but strong against her fingertips. "Lorenzo," Lila broke the silence as she carefully irrigated the wound. "He's your blood. Why would he do this? The syndicate is already yours." Sebastian let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He leaned back, staring at the concrete ceiling. "In this life, blood doesn't mean loyalty, Lila. Blood just means they know exactly where to insert the knife. Lorenzo always hated playing second fiddle. My father groomed me for the seat. Lorenzo got the Southside Territory, a consolation prize. I thought he was satisfied. I was a fool. You trusted your brother. That doesn't make you a fool. It makes you human." Sebastian's gaze snapped down to her, piercing and intense. "Being human gets you killed in Dakota. The Moretti family has been poking at our borders for months. Lorenzo must have cut a deal with them. He takes me out, takes the throne, and gives the Morettis unrestricted access to the Midwest transit routes. It's $1 billion betrayal." Lila threaded the needle, her hands steady. "Hold still." She began to stitch the laceration. "You need to figure out who his loyalists are, the men who guarded us tonight. How many are yours, and how many are his?" "Arthur is vetting them now," Sebastian said, wincing slightly as she pulled the thick nylon thread tight. He watched her face, the soft curve of her cheek, the fierce concentration in her hazel eyes. "You saved my life tonight, Lila. Again. Why?" She paused, the needle hovering above his skin. She looked up. The physical distance between them was practically non-existent, because the alternative was watching a man die in front of me. "I am a doctor, Sebastian. My instinct is to preserve life. Even yours. Even a monster's," he murmured, leaning in a fraction of an inch. "I don't know what you are yet," she whispered back, her breath catching slightly. "But you aren't the man who bought me to settle a debt. Not right now." Sebastian's hand shifted, his fingers gently wrapping around her wrist. He didn't pull her closer, but he didn't let go either. "I told you that first night. I didn't want you. I never did." His voice dropped an octave, rough and saturated with a sudden, overwhelming heat. "I am rapidly beginning to realize that was the biggest lie I've ever told." The air in the bunker shifted, heavy with unsaid things. Lila's heart pounded against her ribs. She was falling for the architect of her prison, the man who held her father's life in his hands. It was Stockholm Syndrome. It had to be. But as he looked at her, stripping away the armor of the ruthless mafia don, she saw the desperate, lonely man beneath. "Boss," Arthur's voice boomed from the console, shattering the moment. Sebastian blinked, the cold mask slamming back into place. He released her wrist and stood up. What is it? Kroll Associates just routed the preliminary data, Arthur said, turning in his chair, his face grim. Lorenzo hasn't just been moving money. He's been buying weapons, heavy ordnance, and he didn't use Castellano shell companies. He used a third party to launder the cash. Sebastian walked over to the screens. Who? A series of ghost clinics, medical supply fronts. Arthur looked past Sebastian, locking eyes with Lila. The accounts are registered to a holding firm in the Cayman Islands, but the initial seed money was wired from a local entity. Lila's blood ran cold. The needle slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the steel table. No, she breathed out. Sebastian looked at the screen, then turned slowly toward Lila. His expression was unreadable. The money came from Silvio Rossi, your father. That's impossible, Lila said, her voice shaking as she stood up, backing away from the table. My father is a degenerate gambler. He owed you money. He traded me to save his own life. Sebastian stalked toward the monitors, his eyes tracing the digital trails Kroll Associates had mapped out. The evidence was damning, laid out in undeniable cryptographic certainty. Look at the dates, Lila, Sebastian said, his voice terrifyingly calm. Silvio's debts started accruing exactly 6 months ago, the exact same time Lorenzo started buying off the Southside capos. Your father didn't lose that money at the tables. He was funneling it to my brother to build an army. Lila shook her head, feeling the room spin. But why? Why would he involve me? Why would he forge my signature on the clinics? To create the perfect Trojan horse, Arthur chimed in softly. Think about it, Doc. Silvio knew Sebastian wouldn't just kill him. He knew Sebastian would take collateral to avoid a war with the New York families. Silvio set up the debt, ruined your life, and served you up on a silver platter so you would be placed inside our secure perimeter. He knew you were a doctor, Sebastian added, turning to face her. He knew you had access to medical supplies, like digitalis. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lila felt a physical pain in her chest, a profound, shattering betrayal that dwarfed anything she had ever experienced. Her father hadn't just sold her. He had weaponized her. He had engineered her downfall to make her an unwitting assassin, hoping she would be collateral damage when Lorenzo took the throne. I didn't know, Lila choked out, tears finally spilling over her lashes. Sebastian, I swear to God, I didn't know. The poisoned glass, I stopped it. I wouldn't. I know, Sebastian interrupted, his voice surprisingly gentle. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping inches from her. If you were part of it, I would be dead on the floor of the Drake Hotel. He reached out, tentatively placing his hands on her bare shoulders. The warmth of his touch was a stark contrast to the freezing realization of her father's treachery. He played us both, Sebastian said quietly. He used your goodness, your desperation, to protect your sister, to get you into my house. He thought I would treat you like garbage, that you would hate me enough to turn a blind eye when the hit came, or maybe even help them. They miscalculated. Lila looked up into his dark eyes. The monster she had feared was the only one standing by her, while her own flesh and blood had plotted her demise. The lines between right and wrong, captor and protector, had completely dissolved. What do we do? She asked, her voice hardening. The tears stopped. In their place, a cold, surgical fury began to take root. She was done being a pawn. Sebastian smiled, a terrifying, predatory baring of teeth. We go on the offensive. Lorenzo thinks we're blind, running scared. He thinks Silvio is safely hidden away. We are going to smoke them out. Sebastian turned back to Arthur. Where is Silvio? He dropped off the grid 3 days ago, right before the attack in the kitchen, Arthur reported, typing furiously. But Lorenzo has a major shipment of untraceable weapons arriving tonight at the Cicero rail yards. He needs those guns to secure the city tomorrow morning. If we hit the yard, Lorenzo will have to respond personally. He can't afford to lose that ordnance. Gear up, Sebastian ordered. Call the loyalists. We hit Cicero in 2 hours. Lila stepped forward. I'm coming with you. Absolutely not, Sebastian snapped. You are staying in the bunker. It's safe here. If Lorenzo's men take this bunker, I'm a sitting duck, Lila argued, her eyes flashing. Furthermore, if you get shot again, Arthur isn't going to save you with a dirty towel. You need a medic on site. I'm coming. Sebastian stared at her. He saw the fire, the absolute refusal to be a victim anymore. He realized that keeping her locked away was an insult to the warrior she had become. Arthur, Sebastian said, not breaking eye contact with Lila, get her a vest. 2 hours later, the rain had turned into a torrential downpour, turning the Cicero rail yards into a muddy, pitch-black labyrinth of rusting shipping containers and train cars. Sebastian led a strike team of 20 heavily armed loyalists. Lila stayed in the armored command SUV parked a quarter-mile away, monitoring the encrypted radio feeds alongside a communications tech. She wore a lightweight Kevlar vest over a black tactical turtleneck, her medical kit secured to her thigh. The ambush was textbook. Breach! 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 Sebastian's voice crackled over the radio. Gunfire erupted, the heavy thump 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 of suppressed automatic weapons echoing across the yard. Lila listened with her heart in her throat as Sebastian's men systematically dismantled Lorenzo's security detail. It was brutal and efficient. We have the weapons, Arthur reported over the comms. Container secured. But Lorenzo isn't here, boss. Lila frowned, looking at the thermal satellite feed on the SUV's monitor. Wait, she said, pressing the mic button. Sebastian, you have multiple heat signatures converging on your 6 o'clock. They were hiding in the sleeper cars. It's a trap. Fall back, Sebastian roared over the radio. The sound of an explosion shook the ground, rattling the windows of the SUV. Static flooded the channel. Sebastian! Lila screamed into the mic. Sebastian! Report! Silence. We need to move the SUV, the comms tech said frantically, throwing the vehicle into drive. They know we're here. Stop the car! Lila ordered, pulling a Sig Sauer P-226 from her tactical belt, a weapon Arthur had given her a crash course on back at the bunker. Open the doors! Before the tech could argue, the back doors of the SUV were yanked open from the outside. Lila raised her gun, her finger hovering over the trigger. Standing in the pouring rain, illuminated by the red glow of the taillights, was Silvio Rossi. He held a revolver, aimed directly at her chest. Beside him stood Lorenzo Castellano, grinning like a madman. Hello, Lila, Silvio said, his voice trembling slightly. Whether from the cold or guilt, she couldn't tell. Put the gun down, Doc, Lorenzo sneered, stepping into the light. He looked remarkably like Sebastian, but his eyes lacked the profound depth. They were just cruel and empty. My idiot brother is currently pinned down by 40 of my best men. He's not coming to save you. Lila kept her weapon raised, staring at the man who had raised her. You set me up. You used my name to fund a war, and you sent me to Sebastian to be slaughtered. Silvio swallowed hard, refusing to meet her eyes. I had to, Lila. Sophia. Lorenzo threatened Sophia. I had to protect your sister. You're strong. You can survive anything. Sophia couldn't. The lie was so pathetic it almost made Lila laugh. He hadn't protected anyone but himself. Drop the gun, Lila, Lorenzo ordered, raising his own weapon. You're coming with us. Sebastian loves playing the hero. When I broadcast a video of me putting a bullet in your head, he'll break cover. He'll die, trying to save the girl he swore he never wanted. Lila's finger tightened on the trigger. She had never fired a gun at a human being. Her entire life was dedicated to fixing broken bodies, not creating them. But as she looked at Lorenzo, the man trying to murder the only person who had actually protected her, the hesitation vanished. You're right about one thing, Lorenzo, Lila said, her voice eerily calm, carrying over the sound of the rain. Sebastian is coming, but he doesn't need to save me. Lila didn't aim for Lorenzo. She aimed for the shadow, moving silently behind him. She fired 3 shots into the air, a blinding, deafening distraction. Lorenzo and Silvio flinched, instinctively ducking. In that microsecond, Sebastian emerged from the darkness of the shipping containers like an apex predator. He hadn't been pinned down, he had flanked them. He tackled Lorenzo to the muddy ground, a massive Bowie knife flashing in the ambient light. Silvio panicked, turning his gun towards Sebastian. Dad, no! Lila screamed, leaping from the back of the SUV. But it was too late. Arthur, arriving from the perimeter, fired a single suppressed shot. Silvio Rossi collapsed backward into the mud, a dark hole appearing in the center of his chest. Lila hit the ground, sliding through the mud to her father's side. She pressed her hands against the wound, her medical training overriding her shock. Stay with me. I need pressure here. Silvio choked on his own blood, looking up at her with wide, terrified eyes. He grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. I'm sorry, he gurgled. And then the life left his eyes. Lila sat in the freezing rain, her hands covered in her father's blood. The gunfight around her had ceased. Lorenzo was unconscious, zip-tied and bleeding by Sebastian's feet. Sebastian walked over to her. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't say he was sorry. He simply knelt in the mud, wrapping his arms around her shaking body, and pulled her against his chest. He's gone, Lila whispered into his tactical vest, the tears finally breaking through. I've got you, Sebastian murmured, pressing his lips to the top of her wet hair, holding her as tightly as he could. I've got you, Lila. You're safe now. I swear it on my life. The war wasn't over. The commission would demand answers, the Moretti family would retaliate, and Lorenzo still needed to face the consequences of his treason. But as Sebastian held the woman he had sworn he never wanted, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The boss of Dakota had found his queen, and God help anyone who tried to take her from him. The private aviation terminal at Teterboro Airport was deathly quiet as Sebastian's Gulfstream G650 touched down on the tarmac. It was 3 days after the bloodbath in the Cicero rail yards. Dakota was holding its breath, the underworld paralyzed by the sudden, violent vacuum created by Lorenzo's capture and Silvio's death. But the real war wasn't going to be fought in the muddy rail yards of the Midwest. It was going to be decided in the gilded dining rooms of Manhattan. The commission had summoned them. Sebastian sat in the leather seat of the jet, his icy gaze fixed on the New York skyline across the Hudson River. Beside him sat Lila. She was no longer wearing the terrified expression of a hostage, nor the tactical gear of a makeshift field medic. She was draped in a tailored, charcoal gray Tom Ford pantsuit, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. She looked every inch the ruthless consort of a mafia kingpin. You don't have to be in that room, Lila, Sebastian said, his voice low, breaking the hum of the jet engines. Carmine Sabatino is an old-world butcher. The commission doesn't respect women at the table. They will try to use you to unbalance me. Lila turned to him, her hazel eyes steady. Victor Moretti is going to lie. He's going to claim you killed my father, a made man, unprovoked, to justify a hit on you. I am the only living witness to my father's treason and his alliance with Lorenzo. My presence isn't a liability, Sebastian. It's your checkmate. A faint, proud smile ghosted across Sebastian's lips. He reached out, his hand enveloping hers. The heavy gold of his signet ring pressed against her skin, a physical brand of his protection. Stay behind me. If guns clear leather, you drop to the floor. Arthur has a strike team waiting in the service elevators. A convoy of black Cadillac Escalades transported them into the heart of the financial district. Their destination was a private, subterranean dining room beneath Delmonico's, a historic steakhouse that had brokered more illegal blood money than the Federal Reserve. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, with cigar smoke and ancient lethal power. At the head of the long mahogany table sat Carmine Sabatino, the boss of the 5 families, looking like a frail grandfather until you met his dead reptilian eyes. To his right sat Victor Moretti, his custom Brioni suit straining against his bullish frame. Victor was radiating a smug, aggressive energy. Sebastian entered, flanked by Arthur and 2 heavily armed loyalists. Lila walked beside him, her chin held high. 2 of Sebastian's men dragged a battered, zip-tied Lorenzo into the room, throwing him roughly onto a wooden chair at the foot of the table. Victor Moretti's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second when he saw Lorenzo, but he quickly recovered, slamming his fist onto the table. "This is an outrage," Victor bellowed, pointing a thick finger at Sebastian. "You bring a woman to a commission sit-down, and you drag your own flesh and blood in here like a dog? Sabatino, Castellano has lost his mind. He murdered Silvio Rossi in cold blood down in Dakota. He's out of control. We need to sanction a change in leadership." Sabatino raised a single, spotted hand. The room fell instantly silent. The old man looked at Sebastian. "Explain yourself, Castellano. The Rossi blood is on your hands." Silvio Rossi forged his daughter's signature to launder $3 million, Sebastian stated, his voice a glacial calm that commanded the room. "He used that money to buy heavy ordnance for my brother, Lorenzo, who was actively planning a coup. And he did it all with the backing of the Moretti family." "Lies," Victor spat. "He's making excuses for butchering a capo." Sebastian ignored him, gesturing to Lila. "This is Dr. Lila Rossi, Silvio's daughter, the woman he sold to me to infiltrate my house and the woman he held at gunpoint 3 nights ago in Cicero. All eyes turned to Lila. She didn't flinch. She stepped forward, placing a thick manila folder on the mahogany table. Inside are the decrypted routing numbers from Kroll Associates, Lila said, her voice ringing clear and authoritative in the cavernous room. They traced the Phantom Medical Clinic funds directly to a Cayman shell company owned by Victor Moretti's underboss. My father didn't act alone. He was funded by Brooklyn to destabilize Dakota. Sabatino flipped open the folder. The silence dragged on, thick and suffocating. Lila watched Victor Moretti. Her medical training kicked in, analyzing his physiology. His pupils were dilated. A thin sheen of sweat had broken out on his upper lip. His right hand, resting on his thigh, was tapping a frantic, erratic rhythm. He's in a sympathetic nervous system overdrive, Lila realized. Fight or flight. Victor wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to execute. Lorenzo, Sabatino rasped, looking down the table at Sebastian's beaten brother. Is this true? Did you conspire with the Morettis to kill your own Don? Lorenzo looked up through swollen eyes. He looked at Sebastian, then at Victor. He knew he was a dead man either way. Victor promised me Dakota, Lorenzo croaked, blood spilling from his split lip. He said if I took Sebastian out, he'd recognize my seat. Victor's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The betrayal was exposed. The commission would never back him now. You stupid, pathetic rat, Victor hissed. Lila saw Victor's shoulder dip. She recognized the biomechanics of a draw. Sebastian, gun! Lila screamed, diving to the floor, just as the room erupted. Victor Moretti didn't aim for Sebastian. He aimed for the only witness whose words could permanently strip him of his power. He fired a suppressed Walther PPK directly at Lorenzo. The bullet took Lorenzo in the throat. He slumped backward, dead before he hit the Persian rug. But Victor's momentary focus on Lorenzo was his fatal mistake. Sebastian moved with terrifying, practiced lethality. Before Victor could swing his weapon toward Sabatino or Sebastian, Sebastian had drawn his own customized Beretta 92 FS. He fired twice. 2 deafening cracks echoed in the underground room. Both bullets struck Victor Moretti dead center in the chest. The Brooklyn boss collapsed over the mahogany table, his blood pooling over the financial documents that had sealed his fate. Arthur and Sebastian's men instantly raised their weapons, aiming at Moretti's shocked guards. But Sabatino's men were faster, disarming the Brooklyn crew in seconds. The ringing in the room slowly faded. Sebastian didn't look at his dead brother. He didn't look at the bleeding Brooklyn boss. He immediately dropped to his knees, his hands frantically gripping Lila's shoulders, pulling her up from the floor. Are you hit? He demanded, his hands roaming over her arms, her chest, searching for blood. The mask of the cold, calculated Dawn was entirely gone, replaced by raw, frantic terror. Lila, look at me. Are you hurt? I'm fine, she gasped, her hands gripping his lapels, grounding him. Sebastian, I'm okay. Sebastian let out a shuddering breath, pulling her flush against his chest, burying his face in her neck right there in front of the commission head. He didn't care about the optics. He didn't care about the dead men in the room. He only cared that her heart was beating against his. Carmine Sabatino slowly stood up, wiping a speck of Victor's blood from his lapel with a silk handkerchief. He looked at the carnage, then at Sebastian. Moretti broke the truce. He fired first at a parley, Sabatino declared, his voice gravelly and absolute. The Brooklyn seat is forfeit. Castellano, you handled your house. The Midwest remains yours. Clean up this mess and go back to Dakota. Sebastian stood, keeping Lila tucked firmly under his arm. He looked at Sabatino. We're done here. The return to Dakota felt like waking from a long, violent nightmare. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound stillness in the Castellano penthouse. With Victor Moretti dead and Lorenzo's treason exposed, the Brooklyn family crumbled into internal infighting, leaving Dakota entirely secure. Sebastian's power was absolute, unrivaled, and unchallenged. But the cost had been steep. A week after the sit-down in New York, Lila stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, looking out over Lake Michigan. The water was a calm, deep sapphire under the afternoon sun. She was no longer confined to the East Wing. Her sister Sophia had been quietly relocated to a heavily guarded, luxury estate in Geneva, Switzerland, funded entirely by a mysterious benefactor to finish her education in absolute safety. Lila's medical license was quietly being reinstated through the intervention of several high-powered, mob-connected lawyers. The world she had lost was slowly being handed back to her on a silver platter. She heard the soft padding of footsteps on the marble floor. Sebastian stepped up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. The tension that had defined his posture for the past month was gone. Arthur just confirmed the last of Lorenzo's loyalists have been relocated, Sebastian murmured, his deep voice vibrating against her back. The city is quiet. And your brother is buried, Leela said softly, turning her head to look at his profile. Sebastian's jaw tightened slightly, but his eyes were clear. He made his choice, Lila, just like your father made his. In this life, we live with the ghosts of the people who forced our hands. Lila turned around in his arms, resting her hands flat against his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. The man standing before her was a killer, a criminal mastermind, and a dictator of the underworld. Yet, he was the only man who had ever truly protected her, who had looked at her intellect and strength and seen an equal, not a pawn. My lawyers finalized the paperwork for your freedom, Sebastian said quietly, looking down at her, a shadow of apprehension flickering in his dark eyes. Your debts are cleared. Sophia is safe. Your name is clean. You have a multi-million-dollar account waiting for you in Zurich. You can walk out of that door right now, Leela. You can go back to being a doctor. You can leave the mafia behind. Lila looked at the man who had bought her life for $4 million. She remembered the sheer terror of that first night, and then she remembered his hands shaking as he pulled her from the floor of Delmonico's. A month ago, Lila whispered, stepping closer until there was no space left between them. A very arrogant, very dangerous man looked at me and said, I don't want her. I never did. Sebastian closed his eyes, a pained smile touching his lips. I was a fool. I was blind. Yes, you were, Lila agreed, tracing the line of his jaw. But I'm not a fool, Sebastian. I know exactly what this world is. I know the blood it requires. And I know that if I walk out that door, half of my soul stays in this penthouse with you. Sebastian's eyes snapped open, blazing with an intensity that took her breath away. Lila. I don't want to be a hostage, Sebastian, she said, her voice fiercely absolute. And I don't want to be a piece of collateral. Never again, he vowed, his hand sliding up to cup her face. Then what am I? She challenged him. Sebastian looked at her, the brilliant trauma surgeon who had stitched his men together, the strategist who had outsmarted a New York boss, the woman who had brought light into his violent, darkened world. He dropped to one knee, right there in the center of the penthouse, looking up at her with complete, unyielding devotion. You are my salvation, Sebastian said, his voice echoing with absolute certainty. You are the only truth in a world of liars. You are the Queen of Dakota. And if you stay, I will spend every breathing second of my life making sure the world bows at your feet. Lila looked down at the ruthless mafia boss kneeling before her. She had been dragged into hell, only to find that the devil was the one who loved her most. She reached down, taking his hands, and pulled him back up to his feet. Then kiss your queen, she whispered. Sebastian crashed his lips down onto hers, fierce and consuming. It was a promise sealed in fire and blood. The city of Dakota glittered below them, completely unaware that the real power didn't lie in the guns or the money, but in the unbreakable bond of a man who ruled the underworld, and the woman who ruled him. Wow, what an intense journey. From a terrified pawn traded for a gambling debt to the absolute queen of the Dakota underworld, Lila's story proves that sometimes the greatest love stories are born in the darkest of places. Sebastian and Lila's fight for survival, loyalty, and each other against betrayals from their own bloodlines is a testament to the fact that fate always has a twisted sense of humor. Did you see that betrayal from Silvio Rossi coming? Who was your favorite character in this mafia drama? If you loved this deep dive into the Castellano Syndicate and want to hear more thrilling, dramatic romance stories filled with unexpected twists, make sure you hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow romance lovers and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next epic story. Let me know in the comments what kind of story you want to hear next.